You guys have made a lot of body. You got a lot hotter than you got in here. I don't know what it was. It's just like the body needs is helpful. Yeah. All right, everybody. Hey, Matt McCooey and Sarah Harari, you guys ready for this discussion or what? So welcome. Thanks everybody for joining us for the final formal session in the climate track today. Really excited. I'll introduce the panel. Just as a quick note and a reminder, sent out an email this morning to everybody who'd registered for the climate track, but after this, a number of us are going to stay in the room here at 3:30 for an informal session on calls to action on climate and kind of what is the stuff that you can do, what are the resources, the people, the organizations that are in and around this state, this city that can help support people to take the next steps, find, connect each other, find help and support. So if you're interested in joining that, please stick around at 3:30 for that as well. This panel is really cool for the Center for Business and the Environment. It is facilitated by Aish. Aish has worked with us for the past year as a climate fellow or as an environmental innovation fellow between Seabay and Sci-City. She is part of the kind of talent pipeline that comes out of Yale, and an incredible group of people. Ben Soltoff, who's in the room, was in this role previously, who's a fellow at MIT. Sophie Janaski, who's a judge for our climate pitch competition, was also in this role. We've got an incredible depth of talent that comes out of here that not only is building new businesses or new ventures, but also supporting them as they come out of the university. So we're thrilled that she's here. She can't stay forever, though. We tried to keep her, but she's moving on. So if you have other opportunities, you can always talk to Aisha about that. I'm also thrilled that you got sort of the intellectual foundation of this conversation is also in the room. So Marion Chertow, who's right there, leads the Center for Industrial Ecology at Yale. She's a huge waste geek as well and kind of knows everything about trash recycling. So if you ever want to go very deep with her on that, you can. But Marion helped found and establish a lot of the kind of underpinnings of the academic principles that people are going to talk about today, or how they're thinking about them in practice. So you kind of get the theory to practice right here. And we're jazzed that we get to have this as our last panel with a lot of people who've been partnered with us, incredibly generous with us, helped build things with us, and are currently partners and help building up the ecosystem in Connecticut. So thank you all for being here. And I'll kick it over to Aish and you all to do introductions. Thanks.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Well, it's my absolute pleasure to be moderating this panel today. And thanks to, I can't believe this is the last panel for the climate track, for the first ever Yale Innovation Summit, where we're kind of infiltrating and making our presence here in New Haven very well known. Thank you for being part of it. Yes, and thank you, Stu, for putting this together. So before I kind of get to understand the circularity perspective of these three amazing panelists, I would love to know who's in the room. So I don't know who all were there for the workshop previously, but raise your hand if you're feeling more optimistic about climate action. Okay, it's not bad. Raise your hand if you're an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur? I hope you can hear me. Okay, thank you. And raise your hand if you're an investor. And raise your hand if you're supporting this community in the best way possible. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So let's now kind of understand these, the background and journeys of these great panelists. So Danielle, starting with you, you majored in philosophy in your undergrad. I guess took that learning to understand how capital works and explored that in different ways. And now at Closed Loop, looking at early stage venture. So it would be great to kind of take us through your journey, as well as how you're looking at the circular economy space and how you would essentially segment that.
Great. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, great.
But the overflow room might not hear you.
Okay. So my journey, as Aish mentioned, philosophy, religious studies, political theory in undergrad, really just interested in how the world works. That led me to work in nonprofits and early stage startups, trying to figure out just, like many undergrads, what the next steps are and how to make an impact on the world. And I pretty quickly realized that financial systems influenced where capital flows and therefore where society heads. And so my kind of driving force has been, how do I move capital into things that we should value more as a society? And in the early days of impact investing, that meant learning how to speak the language and actually not talking about impact a lot and talking a lot about financial returns. And so I came into this world thinking, how do I prove to the financial industry that climate is the best place to be putting money today, and the place where you can have the most highest returns, most value creation. And I think circular economy is a really interesting place to be today. So started my career in clean energy and energy efficiency. That was first wave, right? And we saw all the progress of solar, wind in that space. And as that industry became relatively commoditized, actually financing for solar is relatively straightforward today, right? Big banks are doing that. Then the question came up, well, what's the next thing? What's the next most exciting space within climate where we can drive that same level of excitement, returns, and hopefully kind of disintermediate ourselves, right? If we do a good job as venture capitalists today, in 5 years from now, banks are going to say, oh, an anaerobic digestion project? No problem, right? Like, oh, a waste to value project? Great, I'll take that, and it'll be a 7% return or a 10% return, right? And so that's the goal, is that we do a really good job right now investing in circular economy, investing in the climate tech space, so that it becomes a boring asset class for venture investors years from now. Right now, there's an enormous opportunity to have returns when we're talking about waste systems. And, when we define circular economy, we're really talking about changing the way industries operate. Instead of existing in these extractive models, we take resources out of the earth, use them once, and then put them into landfill. How do we make sure that we're returning those resources back into the supply chain, reutilizing them to their highest and best use over and over again? And they're obvious economic implications for that, obvious environmental implications for that, and that's where I get to spend my time thinking both at that systemic level and then also what specifically do we want to invest in at the early stages of venture to help accelerate that. That was a very long-winded answer. I'm going to shut up. But we'll tell you more about closed loop later.
Yeah, thank you so much. And over to you, Marty. I know you have decades of corporate experience and now supporting Stanley Black & Decker's venture arm. So how are you thinking about industrial decarbonization as well?
Well, this is the big putt, right? How to get industrial decarbonization done, and every organization is trying to solve for this. And the hardest part about this whole moment, because the investors want this, some of the investors, right? Many. Obviously, the stakeholders and the employees want it, and the external constituents. But the hardest thing to solve for in life is legacy, because you've got to bring legacy along. And when you clean sheet a solution and you start new, Amazon built all their warehouses automated, clean sheeted, they run very efficiently. But when you go back into a UPS warehouse to convert that to Industry 4.0 or to mechanize that, really complicated problems to solve. So I think the challenge right now is to solve for legacy, and the linear economy, I'm not an expert in greenhouse, but you got 50% of the greenhouse coming from basic materials, raw materials coming into the society. So that's about half the problem. And you create a circular economy on sharing, reusing, leasing, recycling. You basically will have all of your companies selling less. The business models will change. But there's going to be massive political problems with all of those countries that source raw materials with their political constituents, their citizens. So this big shift has enormous implications, but I can tell you it's very hard to do to solve for legacy because most organizations are built around efficiency to perpetuate a system and to maximize that. And when you put something new into the ecosystem tries to kill it. So no one has time to do anything new. That's another problem inside of these organizations. So we have 130 factories globally. We have distribution centers. We're in 50 countries. We're a $16 billion enterprise. So we see a lot all over the world. And we talk to the other big companies doing it. What Unilever's doing. We talk to all the Siemens, all the major companies. Everyone's working on this, but I can tell you it's going to be a really hard project to decarbonize, the world.
Thank you. And Konstantin, well, he's go-to climate person here, leading the $100 million climate fund at Connecticut Innovations, and an engineer at heart, looked at industrial ecology at Yale. How has your perspective on circularity changed with time?
So I studied here under Marion. Thank you, Marion, for getting me into this space. I actually have a background as an environmental civil engineer, so I tend to kind of gravitate to that approach of understanding a system and how things work and wanting to dissect things from a systems perspective, and got into venture actually more from a project finance kind of angle. At the Connecticut Clean Energy Fund back in the day, which had nothing to do with circular economy. But a lot of the materials that things like fuel cells and other advanced applications are using were, considered and still are considered critical materials. Right. So understanding the stocks and flows of those critical materials is really important, and how you can, ultimately arbitrage those for a more efficient, more successful business model. As I sort of got more into the venture world, I started to look at a lot of these companies that had these kind of models and these technologies more with a little bit of a kind of capital markets skeptical eye, and really wanted to understand, well, okay, how is the end user going to perceive the products that are being made with inputs that are from a circular economy approach? What sort of spec type qualification cycles and regulations are they going to be looking at to say, I didn't really like how you guys sourced from 5 different, whatever it might be, titanium sources across the market, and how are they coming together so that you actually have a product that is safe for my airplane or whatever, my medical device or whatever it might be. So I always looked at those kind of approaches with, one, a lot of interest, because I think it's super cool that you can tap all these stocks that are really perceived waste, but they have a ton of value. But it's a challenge in order to convince the end user to say, actually, this is a highly qualified, certified product that can be sold, right? And you're not going to have any issues, whether it's in a person or an airplane or wherever it might be in a fuel cell battery. So I love to look at companies in the market with that approach to say, okay, if I'm going to invest in that company or that deal, that the entrepreneurs, the advisors, the other investors around the table understand that these are challenges that, as the company builds, are very relevant to how they're going to commercialize their product, how they're going to finance their company. And if they're successful in actually creating that circular loop with the inputs, proving to the end user that they can do it, and creating that arbitrage value, all that just checks the box for me, right? I go to bed sleeping better at night. So yeah, that's kind of how my thinking. But my studying here and looking at from a co-location model, right, at Callenberg, Marion, and how being say co-located. I'm forgetting the use case, Marion, but it was coal ash from a power plant that was being used for a drywall board manufacturer, right? And to me, I was like, oh, okay, perfect. Circular economy, clean source of input, no questions around where it's coming from. But once you get more complicated inputs, more inputs from varying sources, that's where it does get a lot more complicated. So that's how my viewpoints changed.
Yeah. Just building on that, transitioning from more extractive models and getting into more circular systems, we need the incentives to align and therefore business models to evolve as well. So how are you thinking about your stage ventures? How should they be de-risking their technologies, especially when they are high capex? They need to, they need to be technology developers or project developers. How do you kind of think through that? So Danielle, if you could start on.
Yeah, great question. And so maybe building on what Marty and Konstantine have been talking about, we encounter a lot of founders with amazing technologies, right? And so much of, I think, being a founder is you have to get excited about the idea, and then you think through, okay, yes, I solved this problem from a technological perspective, which is great. Because the circular economy is dealing with these massive supply chains, one of the most overlooked factors is actually the logistics, right? Where are you getting the materials from? How far do they have to travel? How much cost am I losing on every mile that material is moving from, whether it was otherwise going to a landfill or from some other industrial process? How do I bring that here? So I think logistics is one solvable problem, but it's a really important one to be considering. Ends up being that if you can co-locate, you're better off, right? I think the other big problem, to Marty's point, is backwards compatibility and integration. And that's something that's been true for years, right? It's always easier to integrate into an existing system if the polymer the new biopolymer that you're creating has the same relative characteristics as a plastic polymer, and you can drop it into the existing infrastructure. And so I think solving with those constraints in mind becomes really important. That said, totally novel approaches are also possible. Right? So there are still opportunities to leapfrog existing systems, even if that means, I think, some pain within the existing supply chain, right? And you see that in additive manufacturing, right? Where you can actually change the way things are made. We're seeing that in other kind of form factors as well. So I think working within existing systems, considering logistics are really important. And then also don't be afraid to try to leapfrog if you can.
Do you want to add to that?
I'll add 2 points. The first is some of these technologies are out there, but the only way these problems get solved are with scale. Without scale, you just have a lot of excellent point solutions, and the world needs scaled solutions, and these take bold steps. I know when the U.S. was setting up their EV strategies, they give all the incentives 15 years ago, and Elon Musk did a great job building the EV industry and outsourced most of the supply chain to China. So now China controls the world's EV supply chain, which was one of the laws of unintended consequences, right? But these things happen when you're trying to do things that are new. But to the point of having some solutions, I spent a lot of time in one of my last jobs in Israel, and a significant amount of time, and come to find out that 90% of their water is recycled. In the United States, it's 9%. And we're having fights along the Colorado River. We're having fights in California farms. We're having fights around how to cool data centers. But I think to this notion of infrastructure, the change is going to take infrastructure. It takes a commitment, and people need to do this. But we could do the same with equal or better outcomes in this country. But we're very slow technology adopters in the United States, which makes it hard, right? We're behind the Europeans with the chips on the card. We're behind, and there's reasons for that, because they had high telecom costs, we had low telecom costs. But if we don't do things at scale, we don't move the needle.
A couple thoughts on supply chain, national security, as well as just like the impact of COVID, the impact that COVID had on supply chain, right? Really, I think highlighted circular economy. It highlighted how important it is to have redundant, supply chains nationally and regionally, and like sort of layering on new technologies like EVs and stockpiles of batteries that are piling up, et cetera, really has kind of woken up our economy to the fact that there's this, if it was 10 years ago, probably be, let's do something different with those batteries. But today it's like, no, let's not let those go. We don't need as much, say, maybe from China. We can actually do quite a bit with this. There's a lot of value here. So we're seeing new technologies take advantage of that, and just sort of an awakening or a renaissance, I think, if you will, of U.S. manufacturers saying, oh, that isn't scrap. That's actually a really good input. So.
And just on that, like to scale, do you think you need regulatory push to make it happen, or is it possible to kind of solve for markets that already have established big players and supply chains? And if you could provide some context in Connecticut as well and some example there, that would be great.
I will jump in and say the biggest business driver to get something done is compliance. So if there's regulatory regulation and compliance coming in place, that levels a playing field. And so business doesn't mind a level playing field when everyone has to aspire to the same thing. But that's the best driver to get something done, and then the cost gets passed on inside to the customer.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Thank you.
Compliance is a big driver, right? That is true. We never underwrite to a compliant-driven market, though. And the reason for that is actually like scar tissue, right? Have invested in compliance-driven markets in the past, and you end up with regulators who have regulations on the books but then don't necessarily enforce them. And that kills industries entirely, right, overnight. If the industry realizes that they're not going to get dinged, or they're not going to get dinged heavily enough for their lack of compliance. And that's part of what we've seen in, water regulation and air quality regulation, right, in various markets. And so we always underwrite to economic drivers or consumer, demand drivers that are industry driven. And that's true across our ventures portfolio, where we're investing in seed, pre-seed stage companies, private equity portfolio, where we're investing in larger kind of EBITDA positive, more growth-oriented companies. And then also in our catalytic funds group. So I think the other area that's worth touching on here is there are government drivers, there's kind of innovation drivers. One of the unique things about Closed Loop Partners, and one of the reasons why I got really excited about joining this team, is they rallied a number of corporate partners, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Danone, Walmart, more, to actually fund a fund that now invests in recycling infrastructure across the U.S. So this is non-government, effectively corporates, helping to subsidize recycling infrastructure, inclusive of Connecticut. That we've funded the city of Waterbury to install recycling carts in homes across the city. So there are unique ways of tapping into money that's maybe not necessarily compliance driven. And I think now is a really interesting time because you're seeing corporations invest in those types of structures, not just because of compliance, but because their customers are demanding it, because their employees are demanding it, right? They're not actually able to access talent if they're not doing the right thing. I always tell this story as the American Petrochemical Conference a few years back, which was a fascinating conference to be at with like Chevron and Coke on a panel, and they were just talking about how they were trying to be more environmental, but it was very clear that talent acquisition and retention was the key driver for them of doing some of these things. And so I think more than regulation, like everyone in this room that has a job at a big company or is starting a company or is an investor, right? Like this is like truly the ecosystem that's driving the market forward. I think the regulation is actually trailing more than anything else.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you too, Danielle. I think cost is a major driver, but I think regulation is a close second, especially in Connecticut, where, like for waste, our largest incinerator is shut down, Mira, right? And we're not building any more landfills via regulation, right? Like no more landfills in Connecticut. Towns don't want them. Cities don't want them. So that means that the cost for getting rid of your waste is a lot more because you got to ship it out of state. So that has spurred innovation, not directly by saying, hey, we want to do something with a specific waste stream via regulation, but because the cost of getting rid of that particular waste stream has gone up. So, two examples that we recently invested in at Connecticut Innovations is Cambium Carbon, which is actually a Yale startup that is focused on urban wood waste reuse and making beautiful products. But it's all based on, hey, towns don't know what to do with all this beautiful, like, local wood. So these guys can actually arbitrage that, and they've created an awesome software. They can tell you a lot more about how it all works. And the other one is on animal feed production through the use of expiring food waste, right? So this food still has a lot of value. It's sitting on plate or pallets. Otherwise, it would go to a landfill or an incinerator. But if you actually process it correctly, you still maintain all that nutrition, and you can blend it as an ingredient for animal food waste, right? So huge carbon sort of negative and sequestration effects through that kind of process.
So on another tangent, so briefly, Marty, you mentioned that there's a lot of corporate VCs in the space who are investing in the circular economy. So could you, without taking names, could you give examples of how they're doing it right? And I'm sure you can add to it too.
Well, we work with Closed Loop, and we work with a lot of people in this space. A lot of people, the CEOs are reporting to the boards on these metrics. The shareholders are then getting the ESG reports after the board sees them, so everyone sees what each company's doing around zero waste to landfill, sustainable packaging. I've spent time working on inside the company on bio-based oils and lubricants. We have tools. There's electrification of tools in the world and machines, and people are putting petroleum-based oil in them, right? Which makes no sense, right? So, but getting things to change is really hard, and getting things to scale is what's important. But the ecosystem is getting very strong. I had spent some time in Europe at some of the top universities and see what they're doing in the whole climate space, and it's impressive what's going on around the world. Again, it's how do you scale, and if the economics are better on a per unit basis, the market will drive the adoption of scale. If not, I still believe compliance will need to be forced to get that scale. But Danielle knows this space better than me.
No, it's good to have the different perspectives. But also, Stanley's doing some amazing things, partially just piloting, right? And actually, some of your corporate initiatives are highly aligned with.
They are. We're not bad.
Hey.
We're not bad. Okay. I'll tell you one we work with. We work with a company out of India called CRAST, CRASTE, and they take crop waste. So in India, people burn their crop waste, and if you live in Delhi, there's so much pollution from this, it's the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day for every citizen who just lives there. But it creates enormous amount of emissions. So they take the waste, they emulsify it naturally. 2 founders, both from India. One is a postdoc at Cambridge. The other went to Imperial College, and now they're making InBev's packaging for Corona beer in India out of crop waste. And the nice part about this, it's very regional. Crop waste is regional, and people need regional packaging. And I've spent a lot of time in sustainable packaging, and always wondered why you put a gallon of milk, which lasts 2 weeks, into a bottle that lasts 500 years. I mean, the world has to align the shelf life with what's in it, right? I'm not saying it's a Harry Potter moment where the thing disappears, but it should be a little closer than a little less than 500 years difference. So,
yeah, I think Marty's being really humble over here. But one of the things that Stanley does really well, that corporates that I think are doing this work really well too, is pilot the technologies, right? Like they'll actually, maybe put money in as a CVC, but then also actually integrate that and demonstrate the use cases. We invested in a company called Partimony, which helps create visibility into manufacturing supply chains and localize manufacturing in addition to procuring, more localized materials, which we think is an essential enabler of the circular economy. And one of the things that we were looking at was that, they demonstrated some pretty impressive savings for Stanley products. And so that's huge, right? To be able to demonstrate in the market. The CVCs that I think are more challenging are the ones that are investing alongside the hype cycle of the rest of the market and pushing up valuations because they're maybe less sensitive than a traditional venture investor. And so those are probably the barbells that I see on the spectrum. You guys don't do that.
We're good guys.
So just building out from this pilot scale to actual commercial scale, are you seeing a lot of gap in investments in circular solutions? And also, how are you thinking of potential exits for your funds?
Yeah, well, we're just sort of getting going on the earlier side, right? Series A, sort of Series B stage. So there's plenty of funding available from a lot of new funds, as well as funds that are sort of like conglomerates of strategics as LPs that are sort of in this sort of cycle of we need new innovation, right? So we better start investing now. I think where there is a gap, but it is sort of starting to fill, is within the sort of private equity zone, right? And there are a number of funds that have really, I think, started to focus on this area that it's kind of a blend of carbon, but also leveraging circular economy as and maybe a little bit more as a supply chain focus, but circular economy is blended in there. So we're seeing large strategics focus on that. Some more private equity firms starting to focus on that as a thesis. But there's a lot of, I think, early stage money that is focused on this, and Closed Loop was one of the first sort of leading the charge.
And how are you seeing exits?
Oh, exits. TBD on, I think, some of these.
Do you think there should be a lot of strategic investors as part of these initiatives?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I love, as an early stage investor, I love bookending a deal. I love having strategics involved early on. I think it just builds a lot of credibility for the startups, and it helps them kind of just leapfrog over a lot of the challenges that they have in terms of getting their products into the market and qualified for consumers. But I think kind of given market dynamics where they are today, and some sort of geopolitical issues, the exits aren't as sort of apparent in the next, or in the last 12 months or so. I think that's going to change, obviously, in the next, 12 months, 24 months, but at least from a public markets perspective. So on an M&A side, I think it's very sector specific. I don't know what's going on in textiles these days, but on advanced materials, it's fairly uniform, right? I mean, there's always M&A going on there.
I think one of the problems we have now is, these are two experts on either side of me who invest in the climate and green space, but when you go in front of an investment committee in a Fortune 500 company, what you have to do to present your case to get $1 million, $5 million, $50 million from the boss and the CFO, they don't always know what you're talking about. This is a new space. And in business, the decision maker is looking to really understand how to manage risk. So if they really don't understand the underlying hypothesis and maybe what the difference between polyethylene or polystyrene is, or you don't have to be a scientist, but there is a lot of hard tech here. There is a lot of science here, and a lot of organizations don't have that domain knowledge or that domain muscle. So they, one of the highest values in organizations, most organizations, is perpetuity. People try and solve for efficiency. And this is a whole strategy to solve for effectiveness and then eventually get efficient. And it's just a different calculus. There are people that know what they're doing, but they're usually the chief sustainability officer and some of the other ones, but not the core across not the middle of the organization. They're the blockers, actually. I hope you agree.
In some companies, I think that's definitely true. There are others that are really progressive, and it's really great to see. I have a lot of hope.
Field day tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. I think your question you touched on, where are some of the gaps in the market, and Konstantin, you brought up a little bit of kind of where capital is today. We're in a pretty rough economics condition right now in the venture markets anyway. There are a lot of venture investors who are not investing, right? They're just continuing to support their existing portfolio, and there's not line of sight to them putting money into new deals for the next 12 months, right? I'd be actually really curious.
$1 trillion of dry powder out there, right?
But a significant amount of dry powder out there, right? So there is a need to invest. I think it's but there's fear because people have psychology and they're not sure kind of what's happening. We just had some bank failures that didn't totally sink the economy, but that was scary, right? Like we had early stage companies that weren't sure if like the $1 million that they had in their bank account was going to come out and be able to make payroll. And so I think and we haven't really talked about that as an industry. Right? We haven't actually processed that with our therapists yet. We just kind of picked up on Monday and moved on. Yeah, thanks. So like I think there's right now there is still money out there, but we are seeing revaluations happening, right? And so we're seeing down rounds, we're seeing Series A rounds get delayed, we're seeing I think growth equity is getting hit the hardest right now, and so a lot of companies are going out for their Series B, Series C, expecting high valuations, are getting hammered. Whether it's down rounds or just not being able to raise. And so I think
Solution founders, right?
yeah, it's a hard conversation, right? When you have an expectation of one thing and then the market's telling you something totally different from what they told you 12 months ago. And so I think we're going to find out a lot more in the next 6 months about where the gaps are. And I think we're going to see, honestly, a maturing of the venture industry as a whole, climate tech within that, right? If we remember, venture capital as an industry is still relatively young. And we've gone through this massive growth cycle with low interest rates and quantitative easing over the last, decade plus. The venture industry has never seen this type of growth before. There have never been this many venture capitalists out there. There's never been this much dry powder in venture before. And so we're kind of going through, as a broader industry, our own cycle, our own maturation, trying to figure out how this is all going to play out. And then climate tech is going to be in that kind of broader macro shift. But I think the good news is that, and Konstantine touched on this, like the good news is that climate tech and circular economy are themes that the broader market is now recognizing as just essential opportunities. You've got like Warburg and KKR and like the big names in private equity now talking about these themes and investing against them. And so I think that's the thing that gives me hope that the industry is going to kind of circle back, and we're going to have more generalists investing in the space in addition to the sector specific folks that are continuing to lead the way.
Thank you. I think we should open it up to questions, so please raise your hands. Dan?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Dan Gross, Director of the Amazon Climate Pledge Fund, so a corporate venture capital fund. One of the things that I can bring as an investor that's more important than capital is being just an enormous customer, right? Having the promise of our purchase signal and what that can deliver. And in today's environment, one of the things that I keep telling my team is it's ever more important for us to be focused on investment in sustainability that can also save us money, because everyone is watching the bottom line. Just look at our stock price. We're facing it too. And it feels to me that like circular economy is the lowest hanging fruit. So what I would love to hear from you is, given the scope of Amazon, everything that we do that you know, you've got to have something in your portfolio that you're looking at that can save me money and pitch it to me quickly. And like I can bring the biggest purchase order you've ever imagined. And I can invest money. Just give me a good idea. I got a couple. All right.
Do we have a napkin?
No, but seriously, two of the companies we just invested in, right? Cambium Carbon, right? If you could help connect the dots between like their products and the makers of the actual furniture or the like non-architectural lumber or whatever it might be for, say, bookcases or whatever, whatever the product is, that's just like a completely like what do you call it, escalator channel, right? That's what they're looking for, because right now they're bringing huge transparency to the market for how lumber is taken from one place and made into something and then connected to a customer. But it's not a marketplace for everyone to see. It's a specific customer who wants to know where their lumber is sourced, for example, right? So that's just one example. But as we look at building and investing in a lot of these companies, we definitely have you on our target list as like a fund that will want to bring a deal or whatever, maybe I mean, we're only going to invest in 20, 25 companies, but we'll definitely bring a few to you.
Thank you.
And we'll sell you some tools.
We'll sell you Stanley tools.
Buy lunch.
And we'll keep sending you deals. But my request to Amazon and to any other corporates in the room is figure out how to scale slowly, right? Like these are early stage companies, and Whole Foods used to do this super well. Used to do it super well.
You can join our meeting tomorrow.
But we talk about wanting scale at these companies, but you can't go from 1 to 1 million overnight, and so.
Can I add one to that?
Yeah.
So part of the issue, and this goes to scale, is as these companies get the orders, they don't necessarily have the physical infrastructure to build, and a lot of these, especially around circular economy, have a huge capex build. They need facilities, they need whatever it is around the country to make the products to the scale, right? That ultimately needs to fit the bill. So there's that financial component for that unlock for them to build and scale, which I don't quite know where your fund comes in, but I assume it's probably at that point, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to bring us back to school and have all the smart people in the room go on to the next step. I know that that's something that we could do, and it could really help sustainability. So what am I thinking of? Well, a circular economy it's a very cloudy term. And you're all sitting there using it like everyone does, and all my students and everything. And we really don't know what a circular economy looks like, and we really don't know what one looks like with the benefit of knowing that it's environmentally sustainable as well, and not just something that was a good object. So I want to ask each of you, what does a circular economy look like, and who determines, or how can we determine whether or not the environment is getting the attention that it should in those discussions, and actually coming out with something that really is green and also profitable and so forth.
I didn't take your class. But if I did, don't judge me. But Marion, I would say to you, the first metric, and the first one I'll put out there, is much longer product life cycles.
Agreed.
And if we can create product life cycles that are double what they are today, kind of take out the disposable society as much as possible with products, but the hard products, keep them in the ecosystem, keep this for 30 years instead of 3 years. I mean, that's probably one of the key metrics.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree.
You guys made it.
And then I would say that whatever 100 years down the line, when this table is no longer in use by Yale and SOM, reincorporating it back into ideally a new table, right? And so, for example, we invested in a solar panel recycling company recently called Solar Cycle. And so they're taking all of the 10 to 15 year life panels that are currently in field or that have recently been damaged in a hailstorm, breaking them apart, repurposing all of the, the aluminum components, repurposing the critical minerals. Ideally, we're not there yet, but ideally those go back into locally manufactured U.S. solar panels that then get resold into the U.S. market. I think that's the goal. Number one, on your question of what is the circular economy. Number two, how do we measure the right environmental benefit? This is a soapbox question that I've been mulling over how to answer for a long time, because I think, CO2 is a really important metric. we talk about the environment, and I think clean energy, we've been kind of using that as our gold standard. But it's a single metric, and therefore inherently it misses most of the story. And so when we talk about what is the true ecosystem benefit, we're talking about habitats and wildlife and biodiversity and all of these things that are just much more complex. And I don't have a good answer for you on what are all of those metrics and how do we actually measure the value of keeping those materials in play over multiple use cases.
So that's why I want you to sponsor us into having a dialogue that comes up with ideas, because we know that.
I think we should. I think it's a really important discussion to have.
Yeah.
Constantine, you take it, not your teacher.
Marion, you're putting me on the spot here. I think if I had a blue book in front of me, I'd be writing something along the lines of, it depends on the boundary and the time cycle.
You always wrote that.
But I mean, I think these guys hit the high points. For me, though, I tend to think about circular economy more on a national level, from a boundary and economy perspective, because I think it's just more relevant in terms of how it impacts the capital markets, and how it drives investing and everything, right? So that's kind of how I look at it. It's simple, a little bit more simple.
I mean, there are ways like certification and
Oh, sure.
so forth that again, I want to keep pushing this because somebody has to be the judge, and we'd probably be a pretty good one.
How do you look at it? Can I turn the question back to you? Like,
Oh, no, someone else raised their hand.
Thank you all. Circular economy is relatively unheard of in the United States generally, but in Europe, it's pretty much more common than the word sustainability. In fact, the European Commission has massive targets on this. That being said, in the United States, there are a number of cities, for example, Charlotte and Boulder and Cambridge, that actually have developed circular cities plans. However, for early stage companies, it's often very, very difficult to work with cities given their decision-making speed, despite their proclamations of support. So I'm just curious how you, as venture funds or even large corporates in particular, engage with these cities that actually have developed these plans and targets.
Maybe I'll take this one. So again, Cambium Carbon is an example of a deal that we want to grow their sort of Connecticut presence and sort of their manufacturing and their products here in the state. And the way that we're going to do that is actually help them get into the cities that have a lot of this urban wood waste. Work with the public works departments and identifying where are there potential areas that they could actually develop a transfer station. Right? Where are there like mills that are, nicely geographically located so that, the wood can be shipped and processed in sort of key, critical areas that then allow it to be, processed into products. So we play a pretty active role at CI, trying to get involved at the city level with our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and helping them basically potentially pilot some of these products, and obviously fund the company to support them. So that's how we do it.
One last question.
So as an entrepreneur, one of the things that I have found challenging is finding capital that is actually patient enough to see through some of these projects. The truly transformative projects do not line up well with venture portfolio sort of paybacks. But those are the technologies that are actually going to move the needle. So you're talking about the venture industry itself changing. How do you see it changing to actually come and meet entrepreneurs where they are and the reality of what it takes to develop some of these technologies and build and then scale them?
Well, Constantine,
Yeah, come on, guys.
Well, I mean, you started at a 15-year fund, right? Was it?
Well, no, actually, we don't really have like a timeline on our fund, but yeah, I mean, that is one way that some of these funds are, who are focused on this area will structure themselves in general and climate. They just have a longer lifetime.
Thanks, Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Marty.
There's one point I want to make. Marion, you probably know this, but 9% of the plastic bottles in the country get recycled, actually. And everyone's putting them into the trash can, the blue bin. I mean, we got to figure that out too, right?
I'll just say, I think it's a little bit dependent though, right? It's dependent on what kind of market or sector you're building in. If it's, anaerobic digestion, say, for example, there are big private equity firms that are interested in financing the build out of those, right? And that was technology that took a while to kind of gain traction. But yeah, it's very, very dependent. And, if you're in, say, the hydrogen space, that's kind of coming down the road with hydrogen hubs and filling the funding gaps there. But and I think the private markets are going to be very supportive of that as well. So I don't know, broad answer, but I think it's dependent.
I think it's a frustration, obviously for founders, also for venture, right? We think 10 years is a relatively long time horizon, but I think to your point, it is too short for some deep tech innovations, especially when you're starting to think about, the overlay to biotech, right? That was happening down the hall, right? Those are much longer time horizons, and it's relevant in this space also. And so, I think there are a handful of things that can happen. I think there's a question of how quickly this part of the industry matures to allow for it. One is that you could have longer fund lives, right? That requires venture funds to put that out there. And then also for like LPs, the large pension plans to say, oh, well, across our entire strategy, we can now allocate to a longer venture fund. So on how likely they are to do that. But it's possible. And it's happening in some small pockets. I think what you're also seeing are some longer term hold structures that are developing. And you've seen this with some of the big venture funds that have, and even private equity funds that have gone public, right? Which is an interesting strategy. You've seen there are a number of funds out there that are set up as holdcos. And so you have like these kind of, or evergreen kind of funds, right? Where you have the ability to partner with kind of perpetual capital. It's a different structure. And so I think that as a founder, you get to choose in part what type of partner you want to have, and thinking through how venture is not always the right default decision, or classic venture is not always the right default decision.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. As I mentioned, everybody, if you'd like to come back and hang out and have a little bit of a conversation on calls to climate action, please stay in the room and we'll have that Good luck, Marty. It's interesting.